For centuries, one part of America developed almost separately from the rest of the country, at its own pace, by its own rules. And over time, Appalachia became so different from the rest of America that on both sides of that cultural divide, the region began to feel almost like a separate country hidden inside the United States. But the biggest question was never just how isolated Appalachia was. It was how an entire region inside the United States slowly began to live almost separately from the rest of the country. How did part of America not only become physically cut off by mountains, but gradually begin to shut itself off from the outside world on purpose? How did the people of Appalachia manage to preserve their own identity for so long without fully dissolving into the America that was rapidly changing around them? Why did so many Appalachian families spend generations living inside nearly closed clans and communities deep in their valleys, distrusting the outside world and relying almost entirely on their own families, neighbors, churches, and internal way of life? And how did part of America manage to preserve a dialect that still contained elements of speech which had disappeared from England itself centuries ago? Perhaps the most surprising part is that many people in Appalachia never wanted to become like the rest of America in the first place. While the country accelerated, built massive cities, and became more dependent on the outside world, Appalachia seemed to move in the opposite direction. Slower, more isolated, and by its own rules. What the rest of America would later describe as poverty and backwardness was often seen very differently inside the region itself, as independence, self-reliance, and the ability to live without constant dependence on the outside world. And over time, Appalachia became so different from the rest of America that on both sides of that cultural divide, the region began to feel almost like a separate country hidden inside the United States. But to understand how any of this became possible, we first need to understand what separated Appalachia from the rest of America more powerfully than laws or borders ever could. Appalachia did not become separate because its people suddenly decided to isolate themselves from the rest of the country. In many ways, the geography of the region itself created the conditions in which an entirely different way of life could survive for centuries. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest and longest mountain ranges in North America. And long before modern roads existed, they turned many of the region's valleys into worlds of their own. Some communities were so difficult to reach that traveling to the nearest towns could take hours, sometimes even days. But it was this isolation that slowly allowed Appalachia to preserve things the rest of America was beginning to lose. While the country accelerated, Appalachia moved more slowly. While America became increasingly dependent on large cities and the outside world, many communities in the region continued to build their lives around family, neighbors, church, and local traditions. And the longer the mountains separated Appalachia from the rest of the country, the more the region began to develop along its own path. Eventually, that separation became visible, even in the way Appalachia sounded. Over time, Appalachia began to feel to many Americans almost like a place suspended between different eras. People visiting some parts of the region for the first time often described a strange feeling, as if they had stepped into a completely different version of America. Slower, more closed off, and barely touched by the pace of life that had already become normal across the rest of the country. In some communities, everyday habits, ways of communicating, and even the rhythm of daily life remained nearly unchanged for generations. Researchers were especially surprised by something else. In certain parts of Appalachia, people still used speech patterns and linguistic forms that had long disappeared from everyday language in Britain itself. Because of this, many outsiders began to feel as if Appalachia had not developed alongside the rest of America, but had instead continued to exist within its own historical timeline. And the more modern America changed outside the mountains, the more unusual and almost foreign the region began to seem to the rest of the country. But perhaps the greatest paradox of Appalachia was something else entirely. While much of America increasingly viewed the region as an old-fashioned community almost disconnected from the modern world, it was from these mountains that one of the most iconic and recognizable musical traditions in American history slowly began to emerge. The musical culture of Appalachia was shaped in isolation over generations. Through old ballads, folk melodies, family songs, and instruments passed down within local communities for decades. Over time, this music would become the foundation of country music, a genre that would later grow into one of the strongest cultural associations of America itself. And that created a strange historical paradox. The culture of a region many Americans saw as underdeveloped and almost frozen in the past eventually became part of the most recognizable image of America around the world. But over time, Appalachia began to turn into more than just a culturally separate world. It became one of the most persistent myths inside America itself. For millions of Americans, the region slowly stopped feeling like a real place and instead became a symbol of an older, isolated, and almost strange version of America supposedly left behind by the modern world. It was during this period that the image of the hillbilly began to spread through American popular culture. The stereotype of a rough, poor, almost wild mountain outsider that would later be repeated for decades in films, newspapers, and television. And the more popular that image became, the more Appalachia itself was turned into a caricature inside its own country. The paradox was that many of the people shaping this image had never actually lived in Appalachia, and often had never even been there at all. Over time, the region began to exist in two different versions at once: the real Appalachia and the version of Appalachia the rest of America had invented for itself. But despite all of this, Appalachia was never simply a distant region existing somewhere outside the rest of the country. In reality, America depended on Appalachia far more than it was willing to admit. For decades, coal from the Appalachian Mountains helped power factories, railroads, power stations, and the industrial growth of the United States itself. While much of the country was rapidly transforming into a modern industrial power, the resources of Appalachia were becoming part of the very foundation of that new America. But along with corporations and industry came another growing feeling inside the region. Many people in Appalachia increasingly began to see the outside world as something that entered their mountains not for the people living there, but for what could be taken from them. And once again, a strange paradox emerged. America needed Appalachia, used its resources, and slowly absorbed parts of its culture into the national identity of the country. Yet the region itself continued to be seen as something separate, unfamiliar, and never fully understood by the rest of America. Even today, Appalachia remains one of the most unusual cultural regions in America. Roads, television, the internet, and the modern world have long since broken the physical isolation that separated the region from the rest of the country for centuries. But the feeling of cultural distinctiveness in many parts of Appalachia never completely disappeared. Strong local identity, independence, religion, close family ties, and a deep distrust of outside institutions still remain an important part of life for many people across the region. And perhaps that is why Appalachia continues to create a strange sense of contradiction in the American imagination. On one hand, it is impossible to imagine American history, music, and industrial growth without Appalachia. But on the other, the region still feels to many people like a completely different world hidden inside the United States itself. Maybe Appalachia was never truly a separate country, but for centuries, it developed almost like one. Thanks for watching. And now we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Before this video, how did you personally view Appalachia and its culture? Did you know how deeply it influenced American identity? And do you listen to country music differently after learning where so much of it came from? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories about hidden cultures, forgotten identities, and the parts of America most people never truly notice.